Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to another CGSR event in our marathon of seminars this week. But I'm particularly excited by this afternoon's discussion and pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Andrew O'Neill. I know you've all read his biography, but let me remind you of the essentials. He's a professor of political science at Griffith University in Queensland, Australia, where he's also the head of the School of Government and International Relations. Prior to taking on these roles, he had some earlier academic appointments, including that of Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Flinders University. He served as editor-in-chief of Australia's leading international relations journal. He was director of a research institute, the Griffith Asia Institute, and he was a member of the Australian Foreign Minister's National Consultative Committee on National Security Issues. I first came across Andrew's work in a little bookstore in the English language shelf in Tokyo, where I was on a 2-month fellowship at the think tank of the Japanese Ministry of Defense. And this was 2 years ago, and I was there to write a paper on extended deterrence and assurance in Northeast Asia. And I had it in my head roughly what it was I wanted to write, but hadn't gotten started yet, and was looking for additional resources in Japan on the topic, and went to this bookstore and came across his then brand new book on precisely that topic, which covered all of the ground I had intended to cover in my paper, more thoroughly and thoughtfully than I had any hope of accomplishing in my short fellowship. This was we had not met, and this was an introduction to somebody's thinking about a topic and the discovery of somebody who had really framed the key issues, at least in a way I found compelling, and whose work provided genuine insight. I think this topic of extended deterrence and assurance of allies is really back at the center of our security environment today. If you have heard my talk of a month ago and the discussion about potential pathways to U.S. nuclear employment, red theories of victory, Russia, China, and North Korea all think that the pathway to their victory is in coercing our allies away from supporting us and being our partners in regional security, and particularly in time of war, supporting us in an effort to deal with these other countries. So some of our allies are back on the front lines of the nuclear confrontation in a way that we kind of lost interest in as a country. And we used to think extended deterrence was a very important topic, and NATO nuclear issues were consuming to the U.S. nuclear community for decades. And then came 1991, and we went to sleep on these topics. But if you're an American ally living out there somewhere on the front line, extended deterrence, the credibility of extended deterrence, the qualities that contribute to your assurance as opposed to the qualities that contribute to deterrence, these are very important new factors in thinking about the 21st century security environment. And what I particularly appreciate about Andrew's work is that he brings a unique but region-wide perspective to this topic, and it's one that we Americans don't much hear about. So his topic is, as you can see, extended deterrence in the Australia-U.S. alliance beyond abstract reassurance. Please join me in welcoming Andrew O'Neill.
Thank you, Brad, for that very generous and comprehensive introduction. It's a real honour and privilege to be here today. I've been a long-time student of US strategic policy and nuclear strategy, and this laboratory has featured very prominently in the historical evolution of that. So it's great to actually be here in person. So thank you, Brad, for the opportunity to present here this afternoon. What I'd like to do in the next little while, and I understand we have roughly until 3 o'clock, sort of around that time, is talk for maybe 40, 45 minutes on the project that I'm currently involved in, which is a project that examines extended nuclear deterrence and small allies of the United States. And then for the most part, I'd like to talk about the topic before you today, which is extended deterrence in the Australia-US alliance. I've just sort of realised that I should have put nuclear after extended. So extended deterrence, which I'll talk about, nuclear is part of that spectrum of capabilities that the United States brings to bear in alliance relationships. But the first brief part today is concerned with contextualising the presentation. And I'm currently a co-chief investigator with a colleague of mine, Dr. Stefan Frühling, who's based at the Australian National University. We're working on an Australian Research Council funded project that examines the objectives, demands and influence of non-nuclear allies in extended deterrence relationships with the United States. And what we're really interested in looking at in this 3-year study is investigating the demand-side dynamics in extended nuclear deterrence relationships. And this focus is different from most of the literature on nuclear deterrence, which tends to privilege US adversary behaviour as the key target of analysis. It also tends to focus almost entirely on US threat signalling and supply of assurances as distinct from the role of allies. So what we're really interested in doing in our project is looking at how non-nuclear US allies try and calibrate their demands for reassurance under the nuclear umbrella. And we submit that this is a new focus. At the very least, it's an area of investigation that's been underexplored, underanalyzed in the existing secondary literature. So we're interested in the software, that is what is said, what the doctrine is, and we're also interested in the hardware, what is deployed, when and why, dimensions of extended nuclear deterrence. Our project adopts a historical and comparative approach to evaluating a series of cases in NATO Europe. We're particularly interested in Germany, Norway and the Baltic states, and in the Asia-Pacific region, Japan, South Korea and Australia. My co-investigator is currently in Europe doing field work. For me, this is the first stop in my US field work, which will take me to Washington on Monday. Now, the book that we're working on as the major project outcome focuses on the practical management of extended nuclear deterrence arrangements across these case studies over time. So it's not just a single snapshot of a particular period. What we're looking at is a kind of temporal analysis that takes into account how extended nuclear deterrence has evolved over decades and how the behaviour of small non-nuclear US allies has evolved over that time as well. So what we hope to do really is to draw some theoretical conclusions from the case studies and make a major contribution to the literature on alliances and the nuclear umbrella, as well as yielding insights into how smaller powers interact and bargain with major powers on security issues. So a major part, or an important part of this investigation, is concerned with exploring US perspectives on how America's allies seek to manage and influence extended nuclear deterrence arrangements over time. So the sorts of questions we're interested in asking: have US allies become more or less demanding over time in relation to nuclear security assurances? To what extent has the US, either unilaterally or in consultation with allies, become more focused on demonstrating the credibility of the nuclear umbrella? Finally, is there any evidence of bargaining, intra-alliance bargaining, between the US and its allies over the nature of extended nuclear deterrence commitments? So these are the sorts of things that we're interested in exploring in our project. And my subsequent presentation draws on some of the key themes of of the project that we're exploring, but also on some of the key themes of the book that Brad mentioned a little bit earlier that was published in 2013, looking at and comparing the way in which US allies in the Asia Pacific have approached the nuclear umbrella. So in this presentation, I'd like to touch on three primary questions. The first is, why does Australia matter in the study of extended nuclear deterrence? Secondly, how have Australian perspectives of extended nuclear deterrence evolved over time? Bearing in mind, of course, that no country has a single perspective on any policy issue. So there are a range of perspectives depending on who you talk to in the Australian context. But primarily, I guess, today I want to focus on Australian governments. And thirdly, what will Australia be looking for in the 21st century? As Brad alluded to before, the context is changing for America's allies. The challenges are evolving. In the Asia Pacific, where Australia locates its primary security interests, China's rise is the number one issue in policy terms, how to respond to that rise. Debates over, certainly in Australia's neck of the woods, over how to accommodate China without appeasing China. Where does the United States fit into all of this? Is there a power transition underway? And what are the roles of America's allies in ensuring strategic stability in the Asia Pacific? These are all questions that are on the minds of Australian policymakers and will remain on the minds of policymakers going forward. On the surface of things, Australia seems an odd choice for examining the future extended nuclear deterrence in Asia. The country, after all, is physically a long way away from anywhere else. It's generally removed from regional conflict hotspots. And Australia hasn't been seriously threatened by any Asian power since World War II, when the northern part of the country was bombarded by the Japanese. Unlike other US allies in the region, Japan and South Korea particularly, Australia has never been invaded or occupied by a foreign power. In the contemporary context, Australia does not confront any serious threat to its security. It's an island continent, physically separated by large-scale conventional military threats. Separated from large-scale conventional military threats by vast expanses of ocean. And no country, apart perhaps from the United States itself, possesses the monumental logistical capability to mount a successful invasion of Australia, much less conquer a territory of almost 3 million square miles. Unlike America's allies in Europe and in North Asia, geography has dealt Australia a huge strategic favour. And yet, since the 1940s, Australian governments have exhibited anxiety over whether the American nuclear umbrella is extended as part of the country's security alliance with the United States. This has reflected broader concerns about the precise scope of the US security commitment under the ANZUS treaty. ANZUS standing for Australia, New Zealand and the United States, a treaty that was concluded in 1951. These concerns have been accentuated by Washington's occasional evasiveness on the issue, particularly during the 1960s when Australia found itself in a confrontation with Indonesia over the formation of Malaysia, and perhaps more recently when the US was perceived as being somewhat slow off the mark in offering military assistance and political support to Australia's efforts in leading the intervention in East Timor in 1999. So Australia is a different case study to Japan and South Korea, and it provides an important test of the ongoing relevance of extended nuclear deterrence in Asia. In particular, Australia provides a useful outlier case study. it doesn't confront any direct or immediate security threats, and it is not in receipt of a publicly explicit nuclear guarantee from Washington. Now, since the 1940s, nuclear weapons have played an important part in Australia's strategic policy. Australian uranium exports supported the development of the American and British atomic weapons programs in the post-war era, which continued the enthusiastic policy of support for the early Manhattan Project and for Britain's efforts to acquire an independent nuclear deterrent after it was excluded from the US nuclear program following the 1946 McMahon Act. Australia's desire during the 1950s for a nuclear guarantee from Britain influenced the Menzies government, which was in power from 1949 to 1966, influenced the Menzies government's decision to allow British nuclear testing and joint atomic trials on Australian territory during the 1950s and 1960s. So it was during this time that the Menzies government sought to find out what the scope was for leasing tactical nuclear weapons from the US and the United Kingdom. In particular, the Menzies government was concerned, it was focused on the perceived threat from Indonesia, the fact that Australia was a sparsely populated but very large physical country. So in that sense, there was perceived vulnerabilities in the northern areas of Australia, which were particularly sparsely populated at that time. And there was general sympathy within the Australian government for exploring the possible acquisition of tactical nuclear weapons. The view at the time, the view since, has been that Menzies himself, the Prime Minister, didn't push particularly hard and that some of his cabinet colleagues were more enthusiastic for gaining access to US and British tactical nuclear weapons. But in the end, this experiment came to very little. The Americans were not particularly keen, and the British were not particularly keen either. And so attention turned to the possibility of Australia developing its own indigenous nuclear weapons program. And this was a conversation, primarily, it's to be said, an elite and academically driven conversation that was had during the 1960s. Successive governments sought to preserve Australia's option for acquiring nuclear weapons while at the same time avoiding any decision to commence a development program. Now, this wasn't unusual at the time, with other democratic US allies, Japan and West Germany, and neutral Sweden and Switzerland falling into this category. The hedging approach was mirrored in the large-scale funding and ambitious research and development agenda for Australia's Atomic Energy Agency, which was created earlier in 1953. And this support included the objective of achieving self-reliance in generating nuclear fuel supplies. Australia has prodigious quantities of uranium, and a number of Australian governments look very closely at setting up an indigenous nuclear reactor to power an enrichment program. Eventually, it didn't come to anything, but there was certainly discussion, there were plans on the table during this period to proceed down that line. The Menzies government's decision to procure the F-111 strike aircraft in 1963 was motivated partly by the platform's nuclear-capable systems and by the fact that it was the only aircraft of its type on the market that could carry a nuclear payload and fly to Indonesia without the need to refuel. China's detonation of a nuclear device in 1964 seemed to provide Australian policymakers with a compelling motive to acquire nuclear weapons. In a secret national intelligence estimate prepared in 1966, US agencies concurred with the assessment that, quote, if Australia came to believe that the US was being gradually pushed out of Southeast Asia, the chances are about even that Australia would begin to develop its own nuclear weapons, unquote. And so this quote from the State Department assessment, in fact, the State Department's contribution to the 1966 NIE is quite revealing, I think. And it says that under situations more or less resembling the present balance of power, Australia will continue to rely on the US nuclear shield. It would expect nuclear weapons to be used, if necessary, in its defence against Communist China or Indonesia. However, the growth of a Chinese or Indonesian threat might lead Australia to want to acquire such weapons itself, rather than being militarily dependent on the United States. I mentioned John Gorton a little earlier. He came to power in 1968. He was Prime Minister from 1968 until 1971. Gorton was more frank than his predecessors in doubting the credibility of American commitments under the ANZUS Treaty. He was also more sympathetic to the idea of greater self-reliance in strategic planning. Gorton, after all, on several occasions referred to Australia, the need for Australia to aspire to be the Israel of the Asia-Pacific, sparsely populated, isolated politically, in a region that was generally seen as being unfriendly, potentially even quite hostile. So Gorton was highly nationalistic, more sympathetic to the idea of greater self-reliance in strategic planning, which was in line with a more general perception of a more independent role for Australia in the world. The Gorton government was never committed to acquiring nuclear weapons, but it was intent on preserving Australia's options to do so should a future government decide to review strategic policy. An important reason for this uncertainty over whether the United States would consider nuclear weapons an important reason for this uncertainty was doubt over whether the United States would consider using nuclear weapons in the defence of Australian interests. Now, this was a theme that had been raised by Gorton himself in conversations with US officials. In a cablegram to the then Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, the US Embassy in Australia in 1968, noted that Gorton had, quote, sounded almost like de Gaulle in saying that Australia could not rely upon the United States for nuclear weapons under ANZUS in the event of nuclear blackmail or attack on Australia. Now, it was ironic that these doubts about the credibility of US extended nuclear deterrence arose during a period when Australia's integration into America's global nuclear command and control network was itself growing. Of particular significance was the establishment of the US Naval Communications Station at Northwest Cape in Western Australia in 1967. The purpose of the Northwest Cape facility included communicating with nuclear-armed submarines and surface ships traversing the Indian Ocean and the Southwest Pacific. Approval was also given for the creation of two major US intelligence facilities, one at Pine Gap in the Northern Territory and the other one at Narungga in South Australia. The latter facility at Narungga, approved by the Gorton government, was highly relevant to US nuclear deterrence because of its ability to detect ballistic missile launches inside the Soviet Union via the Defence Support Program satellite network. This deepening commitment to the operational network underpinning America's global military capabilities was a major step, not just in reinforcing the strategic depth of the alliance in practical terms, but also in effectively locking Australia into supporting US nuclear strategy. Despite the formal term joint facilities being adopted in 1974, the intelligence installations at Northwest Cape, Pine Gap and Narungga were essentially US controlled until the mid-1980s. This meant that Australia had limited input into determining day-to-day operational decisions at each installation and how the intelligence gathered by each ground station would be used by the United States. Indeed, it was not until 1986 that Australia reached agreement with Washington to embed senior Australian personnel in the decision-making operations of the three facilities. Strong lobbying for greater access was based on general sovereignty concerns, but it also stemmed more specifically from a concern that the intelligence gathered by each installation could be used to support US nuclear first strike options, rather than bolstering deterrence with the Soviet Union. This is a particular focus in the first Reagan administration. In spite of not receiving any specific reassurance from Washington regarding extended nuclear deterrence, from the mid-1970s until the end of the Cold War, successive Australian governments appear to have been less anxious than previous governments about eliciting commitments over the type of American over the scope of American commitments under ANZUS, including any commitment to defend Australia with nuclear weapons. Indeed, the Fraser government's 1976 Strategic Basis Paper, endorsed as a secret document but later declassified, was relatively sanguine about the absence of any defined threshold for US extended deterrence generally. You'll be able to read the quote, but I think what's interesting in this quote are a couple of key phrases. And the most striking here is that Australian policy has for many years deliberately avoided attempts to reach understandings with the US defining the circumstances in which it would come to Australia's support. I mean, this had been, and to an extent probably still is, on the radar of Australian governments. They don't want to ask the United States for specific commitments for fear that those commitments may not live up to the expectations that Australian governments have at any particular time. So perhaps some things are better left unsaid, or at least not traversed in conversations. The other phrase which I think is interesting here, and perhaps obvious to many people here, is the reading that the extent to which the US accepts a commitment will always depend on US judgments regarding its own interests at the time. Much would depend on the circumstances of the day. So, in the 1970s, the view in the Australian government was that we can probably rely on the United States if it's a really serious situation, that is, if Australian sovereignty is under threat, but anything short of that, we're probably on our own. And it was around this time that you had the emergence of a serious conversation about the notion of self-reliance, that Australia had to acquire all of the conventional military capabilities to be able to fight a reasonably serious conflict on its own in its neighbourhood, but that it could probably assume that if things got out of hand and escalated and Australian territory or sovereignty was under serious threat, that the Americans would probably come to the party with nuclear weapons if it got to that point. But I think this is a very clear articulation of expectations. And I would submit probably a fair reflection of current Australian government policy. There's been a degree of consistency over time, I think, in the assumptions about US extended deterrence. So we fast forward to the end of the Cold War. The end of the 1970s, I should say. The collapse of détente and the emergence of a second Cold War in the late 1970s highlighted the risks of nuclear conflict between the superpowers and underscored the pivotal role of the US intelligence facilities located on Australian soil. Now, this coincided, of course, with the development under the late Carter and first Reagan administration that adopting more robust plans for nuclear warfighting could in fact reinforce deterrence. As a result, the prospect of Australia being targeted in a nuclear exchange between the superpowers acquired a degree of realism that had not existed previously. And it's interesting talking to some retired, when I say some, one or two Australian retired officials who were active in the defence community during this period, during the late 1970s, early 1980s, and when they interacted with their Soviet counterparts being regularly informed that Australia was indeed on the Soviet target list, and yes, those missile silos in Siberia had Canberra painted on the side of the missile, and that Australia was very much in the game when it came to any nuclear conflict. And this was certainly something appreciated, if not by the Australian community at large, then certainly by Australian elites. So with the end of the Cold War, fast forwarding a decade or so, with the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s and the demise of the Soviet nuclear threat to Australia, and of course all those other countries who were subjected to the Soviet nuclear threat, Australian anxieties about extended nuclear deterrence began to surface. Now, such emerging apprehension was counterintuitive. It's highly unusual for any ally to feel more anxious about extended nuclear deterrence in a context where nuclear threats have declined. But on reflection, it was understandable in the Australian case for two reasons. The first and most obvious was a general uncertainty about America's long-term strategic intentions in Asia in the post-Cold War period. And really, it was not until the 1995 Nye initiative, or the Nye report, which charted a course for the future of the United States in the Asia-Pacific, that many Asian allies of the US were reassured that the US was in fact committed to the region for the long term. Drawdowns, troop and more general force drawdowns in key theatres in Northeast Asia, and the perception that the post-Cold War peace dividend would result in a major US retrenchment unsettled. It actually rattled quite a few countries in the region, including Australia. The second, less perceptible reason for Australian insecurity at this time was that Australian policymakers largely had taken it for granted, really from the mid-1970s onwards, that extended nuclear deterrence existed because of Australia's supporting role in the central strategic balance between the superpowers. Hosting key US intelligence installations made Australia a nuclear target, and therefore provided a compelling logic that the United States retained a major stake in ensuring key national assets were not directly threatened by its superpower rival. The Cold War stakes were very high for the US, and thus the inherent credibility of US alliance guarantees, including the nuclear umbrella, were relatively straightforward. The rapid disappearance of the Soviet threat inevitably raised questions about the scope and depth of US alliance commitments. Growing Australian uncertainty on this score emerged in the early 1990s and was reflected in strategic guidance documents. For the first time, Australian governments began openly referring to the US nuclear umbrella in public statements. In the Strategic Review of '93, which preceded the 1994 Defence White Paper, the then Keating government endorsed a sole purpose approach to extended nuclear deterrence, essentially emphasising that Australia would only depend on the US nuclear umbrella for defence against nuclear threats, hence sole purpose. And I think the quote up there captures the essence of that approach. Particularly the last sentence, Australia continues to depend on the United States for a security against any future nuclear threat. Okay, so sort of assumption that it's always been the case, or at least has been the case for a while, but we're now documenting it in a public forum. And this was repeated in the '94 Defence White Paper, which, with the added point that Australia would, quote, support the maintenance by the United States of a nuclear capability adequate to ensure that it can deter nuclear threats against allies like Australia. So it wasn't just about Australia, it was also the US upholding its nuclear umbrella commitments to other allies as well, and that would itself build stability and blunt any pressures for nuclear proliferation in places like Japan, South Korea, both of which had a history, certainly in South Korea's case, of an actual weapons program during the 1970s. So it was about regional stability as much as national security. So this sole purpose logic underlying Australia's approach to extended nuclear deterrence was restated in the 2000 Defence White Paper. The 2009 Defence White Paper was more explicit than any of its predecessors in stating that, quote, the protection afforded by extended nuclear deterrence under the US alliance has, over the years, removed the need for Australia to consider more significant and expensive defence options. Now, the latter was a pretty unsubtle hint that should the nuclear umbrella be removed or diminished in any way, or its credibility decline significantly, that Australia may once again be tempted to explore the option of an indigenous nuclear weapons program. Now, the mere hint of such an option may seem pretty outlandish in the case of Australia, which has a leading track record of strong support for the international non-proliferation regime. But it's also important to bear in mind that discussion of a potential nuclear weapons option has never disappeared completely from the calculations of Australian strategists, including those within government. It's significant that the last government figure to admit raising the topic of an Australian nuclear weapons option in discussion with cabinet colleagues, as he recounted in his memoirs, published in '96, was former Foreign Minister Bill Hayden, who, like Gorton, remained wary of the value of US alliance commitments in the event that Australia found itself directly threatened in its regional neighbourhood. And like Gorton, very much a nationalist in the way he viewed the world. Now, it should be emphasised, as I've already mentioned, that at no point has Washington publicly endorsed the specific statements on extended nuclear deterrence contained in Australian documents. In contrast to the Japan and South Korean cases since the end of the Cold War, where the Clinton, Bush and Obama administrations have all publicly endorsed the applicability of extended nuclear deterrence, there's been nothing in Australia-US ministerial communiques or other joint declarations to explicitly confirm Washington's commitments to the nuclear umbrella in the case of Australia. Indeed, the silence of US officials on extended nuclear deterrence in the Australian case has been striking, so much so that a handful really, of analysts have expressed doubt over whether the nuclear umbrella applies to Australia at all. However, the fact that Washington has at no stage actually contradicted these statements and has on a number of occasions endorsed the content and direction of Australian Defence White Papers, at the very least confirms that US administrations have been comfortable with Australia's unilateral interpretation of America's extended nuclear deterrence obligations. Australian officials have noted publicly and privately in some of the interviews I've done, they've noted publicly and privately that draft text concerning the nuclear umbrella has been cleared with US officials before being inserted into strategic guidance. Former Deputy Secretary of Australia's Defence Department, Hugh White, some of you may know him, more likely to know him through his recent writings on the US-China relationship and where smaller powers like Australia fit. When White was Deputy Secretary, during the preparation of the 93 and 94 strategic guidance papers, he's confirmed that the initial insertion of explicit wording on the US nuclear umbrella was discussed informally with mid-level Pentagon officials at the time, who indicated that, quote, they would get back to us if they had a problem. Extended nuclear deterrence has become more important for Australia since the end of the Cold War. While Australia doesn't confront any immediate threats to its security, recent governments have demonstrated a strong interest in the development of contemporary US nuclear doctrine. Like Japan and South Korea, Australia was invited to make a submission to the US nuclear posture review process in 2009. The heavily redacted classified background documents released under FOI laws indicate that Australia's submission placed great emphasis on the US nuclear umbrella and its role in, quote, in assuring very close allies like Australia that they do not need to develop their own nuclear weapons, unquote. In stark contrast, though, to the Japanese position, Australia expressed the view that, quote, if the United States was disposed to make a sole purpose declaration in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review document, the Australian government would be supportive in principle, but would want to be closely consulted on the specific details, unquote. There is also some evidence that Australia may be becoming more concerned with a broader question of credibility in relation to the American nuclear umbrella. In a 2009 document prepared for submission to the US Congressional Commission on America's Strategic Posture, the Department of, actually it was probably an earlier document, the Department of Defense stated that, quote, in order to maintain confidence in extended deterrence, the US will need to make it clear that it would respond in kind to nations that employ nuclear weapons against friends and allies of the US, even when there is no existential threat to the US itself. So, in conclusion, the main points I think that are worth stressing in wrapping this presentation up are really fourfold. The first is that while the topic is seen in relatively abstract terms, extended nuclear deterrence remains a core element of Australian strategic planning in the 21st century. So for Australian governments, unlike South Korea, unlike Japan, unlike NATO states increasingly, as Russia has become more muscular in the way it asserts its power in Europe, for Australian governments, the idea of the US intervening with a nuclear guarantee is a pretty abstract proposition. It's not something, frankly, that keeps Australian policymakers awake at night in the same way that it would if you were in Lithuania or Latvia or Tokyo or Seoul. So at the operational level, the threat spectrum for Australia is not as compelling, it is not as urgent as it is for other US allies. So extended deterrence is seen extended nuclear deterrence is seen in fairly abstract terms. However, in the long term of strategic policy thinking, it's still seen as being highly relevant in promoting a sense of reassurance and an indication of the depth of the US commitment to Australia's security in a region that, as we covered at the start of the presentation, is being subject to considerable change. And specifically the rise of China is still yet to play out. No one knows how that rise will play out, whether indeed it will be a linear rise. But there are some concerns among Australian policymakers that the indications aren't good, and that China has a very definite view about how it wants the region, and particularly how it wants small and middle powers to behave in relation to Chinese territorial claims, primarily in the maritime dimension, in the maritime sphere. So from the Australian perspective, US extended nuclear deterrence is seen as an indication or a kind of confirmation of the depth of the alliance and the importance of the US commitment to the region, not just Australia, but the region in the longer term. As I said, however, Australia remains an outlier in having a deep and long-standing security alliance with the US, but no commitment from Washington on the public record that the nuclear umbrella exists in the Australian case. Now, many Australian officials would say there's no problem with that. We don't lose any sleep over that, simply because we're pretty sure that the Americans would be there if Australia was subjected to any existential threat to its security, its sovereignty, its survival. If it was subjected to threats of nuclear coercion, the United States would be there. There's another school of thought, though, that I picked up in some of the interviews, and that is that, well, that might be true. The US probably will be there, but we can't be entirely sure. And when we sort of assumed that in the 1960s, when Australia found itself in confrontation with Indonesia under Sukarno, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations were actually pretty reluctant to support Australia militarily. And the United States was a little slow off the mark in 1999 in providing Australia with reassurances that it would be there to support it militarily if things escalated with Indonesia. So, maybe it would be better if it was on the public record. So there is some debate within the Australian strategic community over this issue, which I think is interesting. The third point, unless they experience a savage deterioration in Australia's security environment, future Australian governments are unlikely to seek a change to the status quo. I think there's been a remarkable degree of consistency over time. And Australian governments, probably for very good reason, that is that Australia is not subjected to the sorts of threats that South Korea and Japan have been, both in terms of North Korea's nuclear program, but also in terms of China's rapid military modernisation. Australian governments can afford to be a little sanguine about their strategic environment. So there's unlikely to be an Australian government that seeks to change the status quo in the foreseeable future, insofar as the future is ever foreseeable. And finally, as distinct from NATO, Europe and Northeast Asia, Australian calculations regarding the US nuclear umbrella will continue to spring more from the goal of hedging against long-term future unknowns than from countering more immediate strategic concerns, which I guess is a point that really interlinks with points 1 and 2 in the main takeout. So look, I'll leave it there, and I guess we do have some time for Q&A perhaps, or yeah, thanks.